You know what they say about trust? That it's earned drop by drop and lost in buckets? Well, let me tell you about the day my entire world collapsed in the span of 15 minutes. 15 minutes. That's all it took for 23 years of marriage to crumble like stale bread in the rain. I was standing in our cramped kitchen, still wearing my work uniform from the factory, my hands trembling as I held that certified letter, the government compensation notice, the one that would change everything. $3.7 million. dollars. That's what the paper said. Compensation for the land contamination from the old chemical plant where my family's property had been. Land that had been poisoned for decades. Land that had killed my grandfather slowly. Land that we'd fought for years to get recognition for. And there I was, reading those numbers over and over, thinking maybe, just maybe, this was our chance to finally breathe, to finally stop counting pennies, to finally fix the leak in the roof that kept me up at night, listening to that damn drip, drip, drip into the bucket I'd placed strategically by our bed. I was smiling. God help me, I was actually smiling when I heard his keys in the door. Marcus, I called out, my voice cracking with excitement I hadn't felt in years. Marcus, you need to see this. He walked into that kitchen like he owned the world, still in his good clothes from another one of those business meetings that never seemed to amount to anything. His woodworking shop had been bleeding money for 3 years straight, and I'd been working double shifts at the factory just to keep us afloat. But none of that mattered now. This letter, this beautiful, miraculous letter, was going to save us. What now, Sarah? His voice was already tired, already dismissive. That should have been my first warning. But I was too caught up in the moment, too desperate to share this incredible news. The compensation case. Remember the lawsuit about Grandpa's land? The chemical contamination? Marcus, we won. We actually won. $3.7 million. dollars. I thrust that letter toward him with shaking hands, expecting him to sweep me up, to spin me around like in those movies we used to watch when we were young and still believed in fairy tales. Instead, he took the letter with the same expression he'd used to examine a piece of furniture he was considering throwing in the trash. He read it once, twice. His face changed with each word, but not in the way I'd expected. Not with joy or relief or even surprise. No, what I saw creeping across his features was something cold, something calculating, something that made my stomach twist with a dread I couldn't name. 3.7 million, he repeated, and there was something in his voice I'd never heard before, something that made me take a step back. Yes, can you believe it? Marcus, we can finally get out. The words hit me like a slap. I actually reached up and touched my cheek, wondering if he'd actually struck me, because surely I'd misheard. Surely my husband of 23 years hadn't just told me to get out. Not when I'd just shared the most incredible news of our lives. What? You heard me. Get out of my life. He set the letter down on our scratched kitchen table. That table I'd bought secondhand 15 years ago and refinished myself because we couldn't afford anything new. He looked at me with eyes I didn't recognize, eyes that held no warmth, no love, no recognition of the woman who'd stood by him through everything. Marcus, what are you talking about? This is incredible news. We can pay off all the debts. We can expand your workshop. We can finally take that trip to Ireland you've always wanted. We? He laughed, and it was the cruelest sound I'd ever heard. There is no we anymore, Sarah. There hasn't been for a long time. I felt something breaking inside my chest, something vital and irreplaceable. What do you mean? Marcus, I don't understand. 5 minutes ago, we were planning dinner, and Now I'm free. He straightened his shoulders, and I watched my husband transform into a stranger right before my eyes. Do you have any idea what it's been like carrying you all these years? What it's been like being married to someone who contributes nothing? Someone who works in a factory for God's sake while I'm trying to build something meaningful? The words kept coming, each one a knife between my ribs. I stood there taking it, trying to process how the man I'd loved since I was 19 could say these things to me. How the man I'd supported through every failure, every disappointment, every broken dream could look at me like I was nothing. You've been dead weight, Sarah. Dead weight I've been dragging behind me for years. But now? He picked up the letter again, waving it like a victory flag. Now I don't need you anymore. Now I can finally live the life I deserve. I wanted to scream. I wanted to remind him of everything, every sacrifice I'd made, every extra shift I'd worked, every time I'd gone without so he could chase another impossible dream. I wanted to tell him about the nights I'd lain awake worrying about our mortgage, about the collection calls I'd fielded while he was at the bar with his buddies, about the way I'd held my breath every time he came home in one of his moods. Instead, I just stood there, frozen, watching him pull out his phone. I'm calling my lawyer right now. I want divorce papers drawn up immediately, and I want you out of this apartment today. Today? The word came out as barely a whisper. Today. Pack whatever you can carry and leave. The lease is in my name anyway. That was the moment something inside me died. Not broke, died. Because yes, the lease was in his name. Because 3 years ago, when we'd moved here, I'd been between jobs after the last factory closed, and my credit wasn't good enough. Because once again, I'd trusted him to take care of us. Once again, I'd been naive enough to believe that marriage meant partnership, that love meant security, that the man I'd given my life to would never leave me homeless. I looked around our little apartment. At the couch I'd reupholstered myself because we couldn't afford a new one. At the plants I'd nurtured on the windowsill. At the photos on the walls documenting 23 years of a life I'd thought was ours. Our anniversary photos, vacation pictures from back when we could afford vacations, images of birthday celebrations and Christmas mornings, and all the small moments that make up a marriage, all of it meaningless now, all of it erased by $3.7 million and a man who'd apparently been waiting for his chance to escape. I need to pack, I said quietly. Good, I'll be back in a few hours, and I expect you to be gone. He walked out of that kitchen like he was walking out to get the mail, casual as anything. I heard the front door slam, heard his car start, heard him drive away from 23 years like they'd never happened. And then I was alone. I stood in that kitchen for I don't know how long, staring at that compensation letter, trying to understand how something that should have been a blessing had turned into a curse, trying to figure out how I'd become the villain in my own life story, trying to remember when my husband had started looking at me like an inconvenience instead of a partner. The truth was, it hadn't been sudden. I'd been lying to myself for years, making excuses, finding reasons to explain away the distance that had grown between us, the way he'd stopped asking about my day, the way he'd stopped noticing when I was hurt or sick or struggling, the way he'd started treating our home like a hotel and me like the maid. But I told myself it was stress, the failing business, the money problems, the pressure he was under. I told myself things would get better when his luck changed, when the orders picked up, when he finally got the recognition he deserved. I'd been a fool. I went to our bedroom, my bedroom. I had to remind myself, since apparently nothing was ours anymore, and pulled out the old duffel bag I'd used for overnight trips to see my sister. My hands were shaking as I tried to decide what to take. What do you pack when you're leaving your entire life behind? What fits in one bag that represents 2 decades of existence? I grabbed clothes first, work uniforms, because God knew I'd need my job now more than ever. A few pairs of jeans, some sweaters, underwear, socks, basic necessities. Then I stopped, staring at my dresser, at the jewelry box he'd given me for our 10th anniversary, the one that played The Way You Look Tonight when you opened it. Inside were the earrings from our 5th anniversary, the necklace from Christmas 3 years ago, my wedding ring when I wasn't wearing it. I almost left it all, almost walked away from every physical reminder of the life I'd thought I was building, but something made me grab the box, shove it into the bag along with everything else. Maybe I'd need to sell the jewelry. Maybe I'd want to remember someday what it felt like to be loved. Or maybe I just couldn't bear to leave behind everything I'd thought mattered. The photographs were harder. 23 years of memories scattered across every surface in our home. I couldn't take them all, couldn't carry the weight of that much history. So I grabbed a few, our wedding photo, a picture of us from our honeymoon, when we were so young and stupid and happy, a snapshot from last Christmas when I'd still believed things could get better. Looking at that Christmas photo hurt more than anything else, because I remembered that day. I remembered working overtime for 3 weeks straight to afford the gifts under the tree. Remembered Marcus complaining about my mother's turkey being too dry. Remembered how he'd spent most of the day on his phone, checking orders that never came, chasing dreams that never materialized. But in that photo, we looked happy. We looked like a couple who'd weather any storm together. What a joke. I was zipping up the bag when I heard a knock at the door. For a split second, my heart leaped, thinking maybe Marcus had come back. Maybe he'd realized what he was doing. Maybe the last hour had been some kind of terrible nightmare. Instead, it was a man in a cheap suit holding a manila envelope. Sarah Williams? Yes. Divorce papers. You need to sign these. Just like that. No ceremony, no discussion, no chance to process what was happening. Just a stranger at my door with legal documents that would erase my marriage like it had never existed. I invited him in. What choice did I have? And sat at that same kitchen table where I'd been so happy just an hour before. The papers were thick, full of legal language I didn't understand, but the gist was clear enough. Marcus wanted out, and he wanted out fast. Your husband mentioned you'd be cooperative about this, the man said, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. He said you'd sign without any issues. Cooperative. That's what I'd been my entire marriage, wasn't it? Cooperative, accommodating, understanding, always bending, always compromising, always putting his needs before my own. Well, why stop now? Where do I sign? He showed me, pointing to lines marked with little yellow tabs. Sarah Williams, Sarah Williams, Sarah Williams, over and over, signing away my life with each stroke of the pen. When I got to the section about asset division, I almost laughed. What assets? Our car was barely running. Our furniture was secondhand. Our savings account had exactly $47 in it. The only thing of value was that compensation payment, and according to these papers, that belonged entirely to him. There's one more thing, the man said as I signed the last page. You'll need to appear at First National Bank on Monday morning at 10 a.m. Something about your husband's compensation payment. They said your presence was required. Required? Why? I don't know the details, just that the bank requested you be there for some kind of verification or documentation. Probably just a formality. A formality. Everything was just a formality now. My marriage, my divorce, my entire existence reduced to signatures on legal documents and appointments at banks for payments that weren't mine. I signed the last paper, handed over the pen, and watched my marriage officially end. 23 years, reduced to a stack of papers and a manila envelope. "I'm sorry," the man said as he gathered up the documents, and I could see he meant it, could see the discomfort in his eyes. He'd probably done hundreds of these, but something about the situation had gotten to him. "It's not your fault," I told him, and I meant it. None of this was his fault. It wasn't even entirely Marcus's fault, if I was being honest. Maybe we'd both been living a lie for years. Maybe we'd both been too afraid to admit that what we'd had was already dead, that we'd been going through the motions of a marriage while the substance of it rotted away beneath the surface. After he left, I sat in that kitchen for another 20 minutes, staring at the walls, listening to the familiar sounds of our neighbors going about their lives. Mrs. Rodriguez upstairs was cooking something that smelled like cumin and garlic. The couple next door was arguing about whose turn it was to take out the trash. Normal people living normal lives, while mine fell apart around me. Finally, I stood up, shouldered my bag, and took one last look around the apartment that had been my home for 3 years, at the life I was leaving behind, at the woman I'd been when I'd walked through that door for the first time. Full of hope that this move would be a fresh start for us. I'd been wrong about a lot of things, but I'd been especially wrong about fresh starts. I walked out of that apartment and didn't look back. Didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't fall apart on the sidewalk like part of me wanted to. I just walked away, one foot in front of the other, carrying everything I owned in a single bag and trying not to think about where I was going to sleep that night. The irony wasn't lost on me. A few hours ago, I'd been a millionaire, at least on paper. Now I was homeless, jobless by Monday, since I'd need to figure out how to get to work from wherever I ended up, and completely alone for the first time in my adult life. But you know what? There was something almost liberating about hitting rock bottom. When you've lost everything, when you've been stripped down to nothing but the clothes on your back and the breath in your lungs, there's a strange kind of freedom in it. No more pretending, no more making excuses, no more lying to yourself about what your life really is. I walked to the bus station and bought a ticket to my sister's town 3 hours away. Linda had always said I could come stay if I needed to, though I'd never imagined I'd need to take her up on it like this. I'd call her from the road, try to explain what had happened without breaking down completely. The bus was nearly empty, just me, an elderly man with a cane, and a young woman with a baby who kept fussing. I took a seat near the back and pressed my face against the window, watching my old life disappear mile by mile. That's when I finally let myself think about everything Marcus had said. About being dead weight, about contributing nothing, about how he'd been carrying me all these years. The rage hit me like a freight train. Dead weight? I'd worked 50-hour weeks for the last 3 years while he played around with his hobby business. I'd paid our rent, our utilities, our groceries, our insurance. I'd covered his material costs when orders were slow, covered his booth fees for craft fairs that never turned a profit, covered his bar tabs when he needed to network with potential clients. I'd contributed nothing. I'd given him 23 years of my life. I'd supported his dreams even when they made no financial sense. I'd believed in him when no one else would, encouraged him when his confidence failed, picked him up every time he fell down. I'd been his cheerleader, his safety net, his constant source of stability in a world that kept telling him he wasn't good enough. And for what? so he could throw me away the moment something better came along. The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. By the time the bus reached Linda's town, I was practically vibrating with fury, not just at Marcus, but at myself, at how long I'd allowed myself to be treated like an afterthought, at how many times I'd swallowed my pride, bit my tongue, made myself smaller so he could feel bigger. I thought about all the times I'd come home exhausted from the factory to find him on the couch, complaining about how hard his day had been. All the times I'd listen to him rant about customers who didn't appreciate his artistry, while I quietly paid the bills he couldn't cover. All the times I'd watched him spend money we didn't have on tools and materials, while I wore the same clothes until they fell apart. I thought about my birthday last year, when I'd worked a double shift and came home hoping for just a card, just some acknowledgement that I mattered. Instead, I'd found him drunk on the couch, ranting about another lost commission. He'd forgotten completely. When I gently reminded him, he'd gotten angry at me for guilting him about it. Or the time I'd gotten food poisoning and spent 2 days in bed, and he'd acted like I was inconveniencing him by being sick, like my illness was somehow a personal attack on his schedule. I dragged myself to work on the third day because we couldn't afford for me to miss any more shifts, and he'd never even asked how I was feeling. 23 years of moments like that. 23 years of being the responsible one, the practical one, the one who sacrificed so he could chase his dreams. And the moment he thought he didn't need me anymore, he discarded me like garbage. But here's what really twisted the knife. Part of me had seen it coming. Deep down, in the parts of myself I didn't like to examine too closely, I'd known this marriage was over years ago. I'd felt the way he looked through me instead of at me. I'd noticed how he never asked my opinion anymore, never included me in decisions, never seemed to care whether I was happy or sad or angry or anything at all. I'd known and I'd stayed anyway, because I was scared, because starting over at 42 felt impossible, because I'd invested so much of myself in this relationship that admitting it was broken felt like admitting my entire adult life had been a waste. Well, joke was on me, wasn't it? Linda was waiting for me at the station, and the look on her face when she saw me nearly broke what was left of my composure. She didn't ask questions, didn't demand explanations. She just wrapped me in the kind of hug that reminded me what love actually felt like and drove me home to the guest room she'd prepared. "You can stay as long as you need," she said, and I believed her. Linda had always been the stronger one, the one who'd escaped our small town and built a life on her own terms. She'd warned me about Marcus years ago, had seen what I'd been too stubborn to see. But she'd never said, "I told you so," had never made me feel stupid for the choices I'd made. That night, lying in Linda's guest room staring at the ceiling, I replayed the entire day over and over, trying to find the moment when everything went wrong, trying to understand how I'd gone from potential millionaire to homeless in a matter of hours. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized this hadn't happened in a day. This had been building for years. I'd just been too afraid to see it, too invested in the fantasy of what my marriage was supposed to be, to acknowledge what it actually was. Marcus had been planning this for a while. I was sure of it now. The way he'd had those divorce papers drawn up so quickly, the way he'd been so prepared to kick me out, the way he'd looked at me with such coldness, none of that was spontaneous. He'd been waiting for his opportunity, and that compensation letter had just been the excuse he needed. How long had he been planning to leave me? Months? Years? How many nights had I fallen asleep next to a man who was already gone, who was just waiting for his chance to escape? The thought made me sick. But underneath the hurt and the anger and the humiliation, something else was starting to stir. Something I hadn't felt in years. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was there. Relief. Because as much as it hurt to admit, I hadn't been happy either. I'd been going through the motions just as much as he had, staying in a marriage that had stopped working years ago because it was easier than facing the truth. I'd been so focused on trying to fix things, on being the perfect supportive wife, that I'd forgotten who I was when I wasn't trying to hold someone else together. When was the last time I'd done something just for me? When was the last time I'd made a decision based on what I wanted instead of what he needed? When was the last time I'd felt like a whole person instead of half of a failing partnership? I couldn't remember. Maybe losing everything was exactly what I needed. Maybe hitting rock bottom was the only way I was ever going to find the courage to build something new. Saturday and Sunday passed in a blur of sleep and quiet conversations with Linda. We didn't talk much about Marcus or the divorce or what had happened. Instead, we talked about other things: her job at the local library, the book club she'd started, the pottery classes she'd been taking. Normal things, peaceful things, things that had nothing to do with failed marriages or broken dreams. It was the first time in years I'd had a conversation that wasn't about money or bills or Marcus's business struggles. The first time I'd talked to someone who was actually interested in what I had to say, who listened when I spoke instead of just waiting for their turn to talk. I'd forgotten what that felt like. Monday morning came too soon. Linda offered to drive me to the bank, but I needed to do this alone. Whatever was waiting for me there, I needed to face it on my own terms. First National Bank was one of those imposing buildings with marble columns and brass fixtures, the kind of place that made you feel like your problems were too small to matter. I announced myself to the receptionist, a woman about my age with perfectly styled hair and a sympathetic smile. "Mrs. Williams, Mr. Davidson is waiting for you. Conference room B." Mr. Davidson turned out to be a thin man in his 50s with wire-rimmed glasses and the kind of careful expression that suggested he'd delivered a lot of bad news in his career. He stood when I entered the room, shook my hand, and gestured to one of the leather chairs around a polished table. "Thank you for coming in, Mrs. Williams. I know this is a difficult time." "I'm not sure why I needed to be here," I said. "The divorce was finalized Friday. The compensation belongs to my ex-husband now." Mr. Davidson opened a thick folder and pulled out several documents. "Actually, that's what we need to discuss. There's been a significant development regarding the compensation payment." My stomach dropped. Had Marcus already spent it somehow? Had there been some kind of mistake with the paperwork? Was the government taking it back? What kind of development? Well, when we began processing the payment, our legal department flagged several issues. You see, the compensation was awarded for land contamination that occurred over several decades. The claim was filed jointly in both your name and your husband's name, correct? "Yes, but..." "And you were married at the time the claim was filed?" "Yes." "And during the period covered by the claim, you and your husband owned the property jointly?" I nodded, not understanding where this was going. "Here's the issue, Mrs. Williams. According to our records, you were responsible for paying the property taxes on that land for the entire period covered by the claim. You paid the legal fees for the lawsuit. You covered the costs of the environmental assessments and the expert testimony. In fact, every single expense related to this case was paid by you using funds from your personal bank account." I stared at him. "I don't understand." "What I'm saying is that while the land was jointly owned, you were the one who maintained it, who paid for its upkeep, who invested in the legal process that led to this compensation. Under state law, that makes you the primary beneficiary. The words weren't making sense, but the divorce papers were filed after the compensation was awarded, but before it was distributed. That changes things significantly. He pulled out another document, pointing to several highlighted sections. When your husband filed for divorce, he essentially waived his claim to any assets that could be traced back to your individual financial contributions during the marriage. My head was spinning. What are you saying? I'm saying, Mrs. Williams, that the entire compensation payment, all $3.7 million, legally belongs to you. Your ex-husband has no claim to it whatsoever. The room went silent. I could hear my heart beating, could hear the muffled sounds of traffic from the street below, could hear the quiet hum of the air conditioning, but I couldn't process what he just told me. That's impossible, I finally managed. I assure you, it's not. Our legal department spent the weekend reviewing the case, and their conclusion is unanimous. The payment is yours. But Marcus, your ex-husband, was notified this morning. He's not taking the news well. As if summoned by his words, there was a commotion outside the conference room. Raised voices, the sound of someone arguing with the receptionist. And then the door burst open, and there was Marcus. He looked terrible. His hair was disheveled, his clothes wrinkled, his eyes wild with desperation and rage. Behind him, a security guard was approaching, but Mr. Davidson held up a hand. "It's all right, James. Let him speak." Marcus stumbled into the room, his eyes finding mine immediately. "Sarah, thank God you're here. There's been some kind of mistake. Some kind of terrible mistake." I looked at this man, this stranger wearing my ex-husband's face, and felt nothing. No anger, no hurt, no pity. Nothing. "There's no mistake," Mr. Davidson said calmly. "As I explained to you this morning, Mr. Williams, the compensation legally belongs to your ex-wife." "That's impossible." Marcus turned to me, his face desperate. "Sarah, tell them. Tell them we were married when the claim was filed. Tell them the land belonged to both of us." "It did," I said quietly. "See, see?" He turned back to Mr. Davidson triumphantly. "She admits it. The land was ours. But I paid for it," I continued, my voice getting stronger. "I paid the taxes. I paid the legal fees. I paid for everything, Marcus, just like I paid for everything else in our marriage." His face crumpled. "Sarah, please, you can't do this. That money, it's our future. It's everything we've worked for." "Our future?" I stood up slowly, looking down at this man who'd thrown me away 3 days ago like I was garbage. "You told me to get out of your life, remember? You said I was dead weight. You said I'd never contributed anything." "I didn't mean it. I was stressed. I was overwhelmed. The pressure of suddenly having all that money, it made me crazy. But I didn't mean any of it." "Yes, you did." The words came out calm and clear, and I realized I'd never been more certain of anything in my life. "You meant every word. You've been wanting to leave me for years, and that money just gave you the excuse you needed." "That's not true." "Isn't it? When was the last time you told me you loved me, Marcus? When was the last time you asked how my day was? When was the last time you treated me like I mattered?" He opened his mouth, then closed it, then opened it again. No words came out. "The divorce papers are already filed," I continued. "You made your choice. You chose to throw away 23 years for money that, as it turns out, was never yours to begin with." "Sarah, please." He dropped to his knees right there in that conference room, in front of the bank director and the security guard and God knows who else. I'm begging you, take me back. Forget about the divorce. We can fix this. For just a moment, just one moment, I felt sorry for him. He looked so broken, so desperate, so completely lost. This was the man I'd loved for half my life, the man I'd built my entire world around. Part of me wanted to reach out, to comfort him, to make everything okay, like I'd always done. But then I remembered Friday afternoon. I remembered the look in his eyes when he'd told me to get out. I remembered the coldness in his voice when he'd called me dead weight. I remembered 23 years of putting his needs before my own, of making myself smaller so he could feel bigger, of sacrificing my dreams for his. And I remembered that he'd only dropped to his knees after he'd found out the money was mine. Get up, Marcus, I said quietly. You're embarrassing yourself. I'll do anything, anything. Just please, don't leave me with nothing. You're not leaving with nothing, I told him. You're leaving with exactly what you brought to this marriage. Your pride, your dreams, and your complete inability to see anyone's needs but your own. I turned to Mr. Davidson. What do I need to do to claim the compensation? Just sign a few forms. We can have the funds transferred to your account by the end of the week. Marcus was still on his knees, still babbling about mistakes and second chances and how sorry he was. But I wasn't listening anymore. I was thinking about what came next, about the life I was going to build with this unexpected gift, about the woman I was going to become now that I was finally free. I signed the papers while my ex-husband begged. I initialed every page while he promised to change. I dated each signature while he swore he'd never meant to hurt me. And when I was done, when the money was legally and officially mine, I stood up and walked past him like he wasn't there. Because he wasn't, not anymore. He was just a ghost from a life I was finally ready to leave behind. The security guard escorted Marcus out while I finished the paperwork. Through the conference room windows, I could see him pacing on the sidewalk, his phone pressed to his ear, probably calling his lawyer, probably trying to find some way to contest the decision. Let him try. I had the law on my side, and more importantly, I had the truth. I'd earned this money through years of sacrifice and struggle. I'd paid for it with 2 decades of putting someone else's dreams ahead of my own. I'd bought it with my dignity, my self-respect, and my willingness to settle for scraps from a man who saw me as nothing more than a convenient safety net. Well, the safety net was gone now, and it was time for him to learn how to fly on his own. I left the bank that morning feeling lighter than I had in years. $3.7 million was more money than I could have ever imagined having. But that wasn't what made me feel free. What made me feel free was the knowledge that I'd finally stopped making excuses for someone who didn't deserve them. I'd finally stopped trying to fix something that had been broken beyond repair for years. I'd finally stopped being afraid of starting over. The first thing I did was buy a small house. Nothing fancy, nothing extravagant, just a modest 2-bedroom place with a garden and good bones and space for me to figure out who I was when I wasn't trying to be someone else's everything. The second thing I did was quit my job at the factory. I gave my notice with dignity, thanked my supervisors for their understanding, and walked away from a life that had been slowly killing me one double shift at a time. The third thing I did was breathe. Really breathe for the first time in years. I spent those first few months just existing, just being Sarah Williams, not Sarah Marcus's wife, or Sarah who pays the bills, or Sarah who fixes everything, just Sarah. I slept in on weekends. I read books I'd been meaning to read for years. I took long baths without worrying about the water bill. I bought groceries without calculating the cost of every item. I remembered what it felt like to live instead of just survive, Slowly, carefully, I started to rebuild. Not just my life, but myself. I started therapy, working through 23 years of putting someone else's needs ahead of my own. I joined a support group for women leaving toxic relationships. I discovered that my story wasn't unique, that there were others who'd lost themselves in marriages to men who saw them as conveniences rather than companions. And gradually, I started to remember who I'd been before I'd become half of a failing partnership. I'd always loved working with my hands, had always been good at fixing things, at taking something broken and making it beautiful again. In my marriage, I'd use that skill to try to fix Marcus, to fix us, to fix problems that weren't mine to solve. Now I turned that skill towards something that actually wanted to be fixed: furniture. I opened a small restoration workshop in my garage, then expanded to a storefront in town. I took broken chairs and tables and dressers that people had given up on, and I brought them back to life. I sanded away years of damage, stripped off layers of neglect, and revealed the beautiful wood underneath. It was therapeutic work. Every piece I restored felt like a small victory, a reminder that broken things could be made whole again with enough patience and care and love. The business grew slowly but steadily. Word spread about the woman who could work miracles on damaged furniture, who could see potential where others saw only trash. People brought me their grandmother's rocking chair, their father's desk, the dining table where their family had shared 1,000 meals, pieces with history, with meaning, with stories that deserved to be preserved. I loved that work more than I'd ever loved anything. There was something pure about it, something honest. When I sanded down a table, I wasn't lying to myself about what I was revealing. When I repaired a broken joint, it stayed repaired. When I brought something back to life, it stayed alive. It was the opposite of my marriage in every way that mattered. The workshop became more than just a business. It became a refuge for women like me, women who'd lost themselves in relationships with men who didn't deserve them. I started offering classes, teaching other women how to restore furniture and, in the process, how to restore themselves. There was Janet, who'd spent 30 years married to a man who criticized everything she did, who found peace in the rhythm of sanding and the satisfaction of seeing wood come back to life under her hands. There was Maria, whose husband had controlled every dollar they spent, who discovered joy in choosing stains and finishes and making decisions that were entirely her own. There was Beth, whose ex had convinced her she was worthless, who learned to see her own value reflected in the beauty she could create from broken things. We became a community, a family of sorts. Women who understood what it meant to lose yourself and the courage it took to find yourself again. We shared stories over sandpaper and screwdrivers. We celebrated small victories and supported each other through setbacks. And slowly, month by month, year by year, I built something real, something meaningful, something mine. I didn't see Marcus for almost 2 years after that day at the bank. I heard about him through mutual friends who felt obligated to keep me updated on his spectacular downfall. How he'd lost the apartment when he couldn't make rent without my income. How his woodworking business had finally collapsed completely. How the woman he'd started dating after our divorce had left him once she realized he was broke. I felt nothing when I heard these stories. No satisfaction, no pity, no regret. He'd made his choices, and now he was living with the consequences, just like I was living with mine. Then one day, he showed up at my workshop. I was in the back room, working on a 1940s vanity that had been water damaged and abandoned in someone's basement. I'd been working on it for weeks, slowly coaxing the wood back to life, revealing the gorgeous grain that had been hidden under layers of neglect. I heard the bell on my front door chime, heard footsteps, heard a familiar voice asking if I was available to speak. For a moment, I considered hiding, considered asking my assistant to tell him I wasn't there, wasn't available, wasn't interested in whatever he had to say. But I was done hiding, done being afraid, done letting this man have any power over my peace of mind. I set down my sandpaper, wiped my hands on my apron, and walked out to the front of the shop. He looked older, much older than the 3 years that had passed would account for. His hair was graying, his face lined with stress and disappointment. His clothes were clean but cheap, the kind you buy at discount stores when you can't afford anything better. He was thinner than he'd been during our marriage, but not in a healthy way. He looked like a man who'd been hollowed out from the inside. "Hello, Sarah." "Marcus." We stood there for a moment, taking each other in. I wondered what he saw when he looked at me. Did he see the confident woman I'd become? The successful business owner? The person who'd built something beautiful from the ashes of our marriage? Or did he still see the woman he'd thrown away? The one he'd believed he could discard without consequence? "You look good," he said finally. "Happy." "I am. I heard about your business, about how well you're doing. I'm glad." I waited. I knew this wasn't a social call, knew he hadn't come here just to check on my well-being or congratulate me on my success. Marcus had never done anything without an agenda, and I doubted that had changed. "I was hoping we could talk," he said. "Maybe get some coffee, for old time's sake." "I don't think that's a good idea." "Please, Sarah, just 5 minutes. There are things I need to say, things I should have said years ago." I looked at this broken man standing in my beautiful shop, surrounded by the evidence of everything I'd accomplished without him, and I felt something I hadn't expected. Pity. Not the kind of pity that makes you want to fix someone, not the kind that makes you take responsibility for their problems. Just simple human compassion for someone who destroyed his own life through arrogance and stupidity. "You can say whatever you need to say right here," I told him, "but I have a client coming in 20 minutes, so make it quick." He nodded, swallowed hard, and began to speak. "I was wrong," he said, "about everything. About you, about us, about what mattered. I was angry and scared, and I took it out on you, and that was unforgivable." I said nothing. "I know this doesn't change anything," he continued. "I know I can't undo what I did, can't take back the things I said. But I need you to know that I'm sorry. I'm sorry for wasting 23 years of your life. I'm sorry for making you feel like you weren't enough, when the truth is, I was never worthy of you. I'm sorry for being too stupid and selfish to see what I had until it was too late." His voice cracked on the last words, and I could see him fighting back tears. "I lost everything, Sarah. The business, the apartment, my friends, my dignity, and I deserve to lose it all. But the worst part isn't being broke or alone. The worst part is knowing that I threw away the best thing in my life for money that was never mine to begin with." I listened to his words, watched his tears, witnessed his breakdown, and felt absolutely nothing. No urge to comfort him, no desire to make it better, no impulse to take responsibility for his pain. He'd made these choices. He'd created this mess, and now he had to live with it. "Are you done?" I asked when he finally stopped talking. He looked up at me with hope in his eyes, as if my willingness to listen meant there might be a chance for forgiveness, for reconciliation, for some magical do-over that would fix everything he'd broken. "I know I don't deserve it," he said, "but I was hoping maybe we could try again, maybe start over. I know I can't give you the life you deserve right now, but I could work. No." The word came out firm and final, with no room for negotiation or discussion. Sarah, please. No, I repeated. You had your chance, Marcus. You had 23 years of chances. You threw them all away, and you threw me away along with them. But I've changed. Have you? Or are you just desperate and alone and looking for someone to rescue you? Again? He opened his mouth to protest, then closed it. We both knew the answer. You want to know the truth, Marcus? I'm grateful. I'm grateful you left me. Grateful you showed me exactly who you were when you thought you didn't need me anymore. Because if you hadn't, I might have stayed in that marriage forever, slowly dying inside, convincing myself that what we had was love when it was really just habit and fear. I gestured around my shop, at the beautiful pieces I'd restored, at the business I'd built, at the life I'd created. Look around. This is what I built after you threw me away. This is who I became when I stopped trying to fix you and started fixing things that actually wanted to be fixed. This is the life I never could have had if I'd stayed trapped in a marriage to a man who saw me as an inconvenience. He looked around, really looked, and I could see him taking it in. The success, the beauty, the peace I'd created for myself, the life that had nothing to do with him, and everything to do with the woman I'd always been underneath all those years of trying to be what he needed. I'm happy, Marcus. Truly, genuinely happy. And I'll never let anyone take that away from me again. He stood there for another moment, maybe hoping I'd change my mind, maybe just trying to process what I'd said. Then he nodded slowly. I understand, he said quietly. I just, I had to try. Now you have, and now you can leave. He walked toward the door, then stopped and turned back. For what it's worth, Sarah, I really am sorry. And I really do hope you stay happy. I will, I said, because my happiness doesn't depend on you anymore. It never should have in the first place. I watched him walk out of my shop and out of my life for the final time. Through the window, I could see him standing on the sidewalk for a moment, looking lost and uncertain. Then he straightened his shoulders and walked away, disappearing into the crowd of people going about their normal lives. I went back to my workroom and picked up my sandpaper, returning to the vanity I'd been restoring. Under my hands, the damaged wood slowly revealed its hidden beauty, layer by layer, grain by grain. It was patient work, meditative work, honest work. It was the work of taking something broken and making it whole again, just like I'd done with myself. That evening, I locked up the shop and walked home to my little house, with its garden full of flowers I'd planted myself. I made dinner, just for me, exactly the way I liked it, and ate it on my back porch while watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. I thought about the woman I'd been 3 years ago, standing in that cramped apartment kitchen, thinking that $3.7 million was going to save my marriage. How naive I'd been. How completely wrong about everything that mattered. The money hadn't saved anything. But losing everything, my marriage, my home, my illusions about love and loyalty and partnership, had saved me. I'd learned that peace was indeed the real wealth. Peace with yourself, peace with your choices, peace with the life you'd built with your own hands and your own strength and your own refusal to settle for less than you deserved. I'd learned that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you turns out to be the best thing, disguised as disaster and wrapped in pain, but ultimately delivering you to exactly where you needed to be. I'd learned that you can't fix someone who doesn't want to be fixed, that love without respect is worthless, and that sometimes walking away is the most loving thing you can do, for both of you. And I'd learned that starting over isn't something to be afraid of. It's something to embrace, something to celebrate, something to approach with excitement rather than terror. Because when you start over, you get to choose who you want to be. You get to decide what matters. You get to build a life based on your own values, your own dreams, your own definition of success, and happiness and love. The sun finished setting, painting my little garden in purple shadows. I sat there for a while longer, listening to the crickets and the distant sound of neighbors calling their children in for the night. Normal sounds, peaceful sounds, the soundtrack to a life well lived. Tomorrow I'd go back to my shop, back to the work I loved, back to the community of women who'd become my chosen family. I'd sand another piece of damaged furniture back to life. Maybe teach another woman how to see beauty in broken things. Maybe share another story about the journey from desperation to joy. But tonight, I just sat in my garden and appreciated the quiet miracle of a life that was completely, entirely, beautifully mine. Peace is the real wealth, and I was the richest woman in the world